Recording in progress.
Yes. All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Job Bible Study Week 6. Week 6 of 7. Next week will be our final session. So last week, we went through the chapters that are about the mysterious fourth friend, Elihu. Chapters 32 through 37 of Job. Just a quick refresher from some of the stuff we did last week. We went back to Job chapter 2, and we saw that it says that Job's three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, traveled to come and see Job and comforted him. And then after the three of them and Job talked to each other for about 30 chapters, all of a sudden this mysterious Elihu just pops up and tries to give everyone a piece of his mind. And to put it mildly, despite Elihu's insistence that he is truly wise and that he was the one who knew better than everyone else because of his close connection to God, because the Spirit of God moving in him, we weren't exactly very kind to Elihu in what he had to say. To put it mildly, some of the things that he said weren't exactly signs of true wisdom. And it showed a lot for a character who said at one point, I will show you what perfect wisdom is, and then to say some of the things that he said. So it may not have seemed super important, but Elihu is actually very relevant to the story because of Elihu's position in the book of Job, where his dialogue comes into play. Going back to the structure of Job, Elihu's dialogue is Job and all the friends get done talking, and Elihu says, all right, Job, this is why you're wrong. All three of the friends, this is why you're wrong. The Spirit of God is with me. That's how I know these things. And then the last chapter, chapter 37, Elihu ends with, praise God, God is great. I speak for God when I say these things, but if only God were here, he would set the record straight. And what happens in chapter 38? That's when God appears. So Elihu's kind of a big segue into God, a big dramatic buildup to God bursting forth onto the scene in chapter 38. But before we go forward into chapter 38, we're actually going to go backwards a little bit first, because Job also gives a perfect segue, perfect lead-in to God's appearance on the scene, believe it or not, when Job talks in chapters 29 through 31. So as much as Elihu's response is a big response to Job, the friends, and everything that was said the entire book, God's response is very much focused on Job. And when we get deep enough into God's response, there are a couple times where God will say words that Job said before and be like, you say this. The words that are being brought up at that point in time are some of the things that Job say in these three chapters. So before we move forward and get into what God's dialogue is, we're going to go back just a little bit and spend a bit of time on those chapters that come from Job. So if we look at the handouts that got sent out for this week, there are 5 little sections here we're going to go over for these 3 chapters. So before we go into those, just a little brief intro to these 3 chapters. So chapters 29, 30, and 31 have all very distinct structures, and each one is about a very distinct point. Chapter 29 is basically Job reminiscing. If you read through all of chapter 29, it's basically Job going, before all this stuff started happening, before I started suffering, before I lost all of my family and all of my livestock and all my property, my life was fantastic. Let me tell you just how fantastic it was in case you don't remember. That's chapter 29. Chapter 30 is Job going, but ever since I started suffering, my life has been terrible. And in case you weren't paying attention, let me tell you all the ways my life is now terrible. And then chapter 31 is Job for the last time going, I don't feel like I've done anything wrong. And if I've done something wrong, God needs to tell me what it is I did wrong. So that's just a super brief intro to these 3 chapters. The way I tried to structure this, because it's important to go over these chapters, but we don't want to spend too much time on them, is that I found a section to pretty much summarize the main arguments of chapter 29 and chapter 30. And in chapter 31, I just wanted to find a couple examples that really show off Job's understanding of the relationship between sin and punishment, that get into how Job would say justice should work. That later on, when we get into God's speeches, we can have something to compare that to. So, yeah. All right, let's dive right into this. This week I'm gonna start, I'll start in the middle. Rhonda, could you please take the first section that we have, Job chapter 29, the first 6 verses.
Job again took up his discourse and said, Oh, that I were as in the months of old, as in the days when God watched over me, when his lamp shone over my head, and by his light I walked through darkness, when I was in my prime, when the friendship of God was upon my tent, when the Almighty was still with me, when my children were around me, when my steps were washed with milk, and the rock poured out for me streams of oil.
All right, thank you. So the one thing that we're going to notice when we're reading through these chapters, and you would notice this if you read through all of chapter 29 and all of chapter 30, is that this is the point in Job where the language gets very figurative and very strong imagery being used. That last verse, verse 6, about Job's path being drenched with milk and rocks pouring forth streams of oil. This is very rich symbolism, because how many people remember in the story of the Israelites going to the land that they were promised? What was the land flowing with?
Milk and honey.
Milk and honey, yeah. In the ancient world, milk and honey are very exotic. They are very rare. Having those things is a sign of prestige, sign of power, sign of wealth. So here we have Job saying that in the time gone by, his prestige, his wealth, his everything was so great that even the path that he walked was drenched in milk and oil flowed out of rocks like streams. He was that well off. So this is very colorful language Job is using to try and get across just how prosperous and how great his life was before all the suffering began. He even talks about, in verse 4, how God's friendship was with him, how God was present with him, how God blessed Job and blessed Job's house. This, especially the relationship between God and Job, is the main thing that's going to be contrasted with the passage that we have in chapter 29 and the passage that we have coming up next in chapter 30. But before we go into that, anyone have any thoughts or anything that came to mind while we were going over that section?
To me, it was a change in attitude with Job, where he's gone back and looked and said, well, I have had it pretty good from time to time, and God was pretty wonderful then, and it's kind of strikes a chord, I think, with any of us when things are going well. God is always kind of neat, going our way.
Yeah, it does strike a chord. It is very relatable. Again, I don't think most of us would be able to say that, the path we walked on was covered in milk, that olive oil flowed out of rocks because we're just that well off. But we can relate to this feeling that Job has, this looking back on the past with how great things used to be and being like, oh yeah, God blessed me, it was great. Now let's compare that with what Job has to say here in chapter 30. Renee, could you take that next section for us? Chapter 30, verses 16 through 23, please. Renee, you are still, oh, there we go.
And now my life ebbs away, days of suffering.
Can't hear her.
Renee, are you still with us?
Yes.
Oh,
Okay, we couldn't hear you.
Oh,
Your
I'm
your microphone wasn't working, I don't think, Renee. Your
Oh.
microphone wasn't working.
Or it's
I think
covered.
what it was is you turned away from your screen. So
Okay,
we
yes,
couldn't hear you.
okay. All right. And now my life ebbs away. Days of suffering grip me. Night pierces my bones. My gnawing pains never rest. In his great power, God becomes like clothing to me. He binds me like the neck of my garment. He throws me into the mud, and I am reduced to dust and ashes. I cry out to you, God, but you do not answer. I stand up, but you merely look at me. You turn on me ruthlessly. With the might of your hand, you attack me. You snatch me up and drive me before the wind. You toss me about in the storm. I know you will bring me down to death, to the place appointed for all the living.
All right, thank you. Yeah, this is a very different depiction of God than we just read about in chapter 29. This is no longer a God that brings blessing, that brings prosperity. This is a God that, as Job says, once again, very colorful language, that God becomes like clothing, binding up Job so that he cannot move and throwing him down into the mud. There's very rich language going on here. A couple things I want to highlight here is that one of the things that Job is leaning on here is, I completely lost my train of thought. I'm sorry about that. Oh, that's what it is. Okay. If we look at this section in chapter 30 and the section in chapter 29, it seems like Job is almost kind of describing two different gods, one that is prosperous and giving, one that is very ruthless and punishing, to say the least. Even in these words, even in Job thinking out loud, fondly remembering the past and lamenting the way that life is now, even in these words, he is still going against everything that his three friends tried to tell him. The three friends, keep in mind, they are very much of the mindset God is perfect, God's all powerful, God doesn't change. The way God is always the same. And Job, with these words, seems to be kind of arguing that, well, no, God used to be friendly, used to be blessing me. Now God is not doing those things. Maybe still raising that question of, has God changed? Is God always the same? Which goes and butts right up against the theology that his three friends are bringing to him. So even in these words, even in these two sections, Job is still showing that he is flatly rejecting everything that his friends have told him and everything that his friends are trying to get across to him. The second thing I want to point out is that these two sections that we looked at very much deal with Job's relationship with God in chapter 29 and chapter 30. If you read the rest of chapter 29 and chapter 30, the central theme for pretty much the rest of these chapters is Job's relationship with other people. Going through the rest of chapter 29, you will hear that Job will say things like, nobles, lords, those in positions of power, they stop speaking when he walks into the room. They revere him with awe. They hang on the words coming out of his lips. They bow down to him when he walks by. That's how well respected he was, well honored he was in society. And then in chapter 30, he will say things like people actively avoid him. They don't even look at him as they walk by. They teach their children to disregard him and treat him as though he is low and that he is worthless. And I just want to bring that up because this is showing a big difference in the cultural dynamics of Job's reality versus our world. Because we have to remember that Job's culture, Job's time period, this is a honor-shame society. This is a culture where the most important things in life is honor, shame. Do other people view you honorably? Do other people view you as shameful? And this goes beyond just what we might think of it as, oh yeah, Job's honorable, he's a cool guy, I'll be friends with him, or Job is kind of shameful, let's not associate ourselves with him. It goes much deeper than that. Individuals like Job who had high honor would be able to marry into certain prominent families for status. They would be able to interact with kings and lords. They would be able to have connections to people of power and influence, like trading goods, traveling the world. It would be very transactional. Whereas someone who is in deep shame, they would be cut off completely from society. They would be ostracized. Those families would have nothing to do with them. The people who were friends of them, were close to them, who did business with them, they would just stop and that person would be cut off. So when Job goes into a lot of that in chapters 29 and 30, it's much deeper than how we would ever understand it. The best example I can think of how this works in modern times is in modern day Japan. Not technically modern day since this is World War II, but this is the closest I can think of. Japan is very much an honor shame society. And in World War II, after Japan had been atomic bombed twice and bombed regularly a scabillion other times, and they decided that they were going to drop out of World War II, does anyone know what it was that the Emperor of Japan said when they decided to surrender and stop fighting World War II? It's an obscure history fact. Anyone know this one? So in Japan, where honor and shame are so important, it would not be honorable to say that you did something wrong. It would not be honorable to say that you're at fault. It would not be honorable to say that there's something you can't do. So when the Japanese emperor decided to surrender to the Allies, the emperor said, the war has developed in a way that is not advantageous for us to continue. It is very important in an honor shame society that someone is able to save face, to make themselves look good, to minimize any negative repercussions they may have for anything. And so while we briefly looked over the way that Job contrasts his relationship with God in these two chapters, there's also a very good amount of text that contrasts his standing in society. And I just wanted to uplift that, not only if anyone's interested in looking into it, but also just to really get a sense of how deep and how sharp this divide is that Job is trying to draw with these two chapters. Any thoughts by anyone before we continue to chapter 31? All right then. So chapter 31, Job is once again going to pivot. This is where he starts his final defense of why he thinks he shouldn't be suffering, trying to justify, I shouldn't be suffering because I didn't do bad things and I did good things. And he kind of shows off a bit of how he thinks justice should work. So let's see what Job has to say. Jennifer, could you take the verse section for us, chapter 31, verses 4 through 12?
Does he not see my ways and number all my steps? If I have walked with falsehood and my foot has hurried to deceit, let me be weighed in just balance and let God know my integrity. If my step has turned aside from the way and my heart has followed my eyes, and if any spot has clung to my hands, then let me sow and another eat, and let what grows for me be rooted out. If my heart has been enticed by a woman, and I have lain in wait at my neighbor's door, then let my wife grind for another, and let another man kneel before her, for that would be a heinous crime. That would be a criminal offense, for that would be a fire consuming down to Abaddon, and it would burn to the root of all my harvest.
All right, thank you. So yeah, this is pretty heavy stuff that Job's getting into. His understanding of how punishment relates to sin, you know. If I've been deceived in any way, let God weigh me on a scale. He'll know I'm blameless. If I have strayed from the path, let others eat my crops and let the rest of them be destroyed. If I've ever been enticed to be unfaithful in any way, let other men have my wife. All of these things are shameful and deserve fire to consume me and everything I have. Pretty interesting stuff. It is a very strong system of justice Job has in his mind, that these are the punishments fitting for someone who were to commit these kind of wrongs. I just want to lift up again the tension and the conflict between the human perspective and the divine perspective in Job that has been at play since the very first chapter. Job is saying all these things, you know, if I've done these things that are wrong, let my crops be eaten, let my crops be destroyed, let all these things be taken from me. All those things have happened to Job. This is why the friends who know Job, this is maybe part of the reason why they're saying, hey, you clearly did something wrong against God, because this is what you would think you deserve, and it's what's happening. This also adds fuel to the fire of why Job thinks he did nothing wrong, because he's laying out, these are the punishments I should receive if I commit these wrongs. I haven't done any of these things. Why am I getting these punishments? And even more so, both of those still contrast with the divine perspective of none of this has to do with Job doing anything wrong. So just want to pull that out and throw that out there again, that that's what's going on here. I mentioned very briefly all the way back in week 1, which I think was in November, to be honest, so it's been a while, that there is language in Job that, because it's wisdom literature, it draws on other ancient texts. That idea in verse 6 of Job being weighed in honest scales, that's an idea that scholars trace back to the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which predates the Bible by quite a long time, even the oldest texts in the Bible. The idea in the Egyptian Book of the Dead that when those who died went to the underworld, their hearts were weighed on a scale before a council of gods against the weight of a feather, and only if their hearts were able to balance the feather were they deemed upright. And this is language right here of Job saying, let God weigh me on scales to know I am blameless. So not only is this colorful language that Job is using, not only is this very deep symbolism, but some of these things are also language borrowed from other cultures, other traditions. So just wanted to also point that one out because it's interesting that it comes up here. All right. Kim, you are up for our next section. So could you take verses 13 through 23 of chapter 31 and tell us a little more about the way Job sees the world and how it works?
Okay. If I have rejected the cause of my male or female slaves when they brought a complaint against me, what then shall I do when God rises up? When he makes inquiry, what shall I answer him? Did not he who made me in the womb make them? And did not one fashion us in the womb? If I have withheld anything that the poor desired, or have caused the eyes of the widow to fall, or have eaten my morsel alone, and the orphan has not eaten from it, for from my youth I reared the orphan like a father, and from my mother's womb I guided the widow. If I have seen anyone perish for lack of clothing, or a poor person without covering, whose loins have not blessed me, and who was not warmed with the fleece of my sheep. If I have raised my hand against the orphan because I saw I had supporters at the gate, then let my shoulder blade fall from my shoulder, and let my arm be broken from its socket. For I was in terror of calamity from God, and I could not have faced his majesty.
All right, thank you. First of all, anyone have any strong thoughts about any of that before I start to roll with some of the notes I've got here? And that's fine if no one does so far. Okay. This is the closest that we really ever see Job get to the ideas of what we in the modern day would call social justice. Job looks at the way he treats even the people that are his slaves and goes, just like me, they were made in the womb of their mothers by God. It doesn't matter that they're a slave. We're all people. We're all equal because of how we were made. Thus, I treat them all fairly. Job looks at those who are poor and those who are widowed and those who are orphaned and is like, those that are poor, I feed them and clothe them. Those that are orphaned, I raise them as my own. Those who are widowed, I bring them comfort. I bring them warmth. I do all of these things because it's the right thing to do. Job says, I dreaded destruction from God if I did not do these things. So this isn't only, God, I've done all these good things. Look at these good things I've done. I don't deserve to be punished. But it's also that sense of, I did these things because I knew if I didn't, you would punish me. And like I said, while we in the modern day might call this social justice, in the ancient world, in Judaism, this is required by the law. This is required by those who want to be seen as righteous, those who want to be seen as just before God. So Job is laying out all these things. God, all of these things that I could have done wrong, I haven't. And all of these things that you require me to do, I have done. I still do not understand why I'm being punished. Job makes a pretty good case for himself. Anyone have any thoughts on any of this so far? All right. Kim, you read last, right? Okay. Okay, so that would be Nick. It is your turn to read. Could you take up that last section for us, that little short one, chapter 31, verses 35 through 37, please.
Oh, that day, oh, that I had one to hear me. Here is my signature, let the Almighty answer me. Oh, that I had the indictment written by my adversary. Surely I would carry it in my shoulder. I would bind it on me like a crown. I would give him an account of all my steps. Like a prince, I would approach him.
All right, so thank you. Job's finished with what he has to say. He's like, all right, God, I said everything I had to say. I got it all out. Here's my signature. Here's my stamp of approval. I said it all. I'm done. Ball's in your court, your move. If you respond to me, I will wear it like a crown because I am that desperate for an answer from you, God. So please give me something to work with here. And this is pretty much a good segue to jump from where we are all the way to chapter 38, because Job says this. That's the end of my argument. That's what I have to say. God, please respond. And in chapter 38, God appears in a storm and has some things to say. But before we jump to chapter 38, anyone have any final thoughts, comments, questions about anything that we did in these last three chapters?
On this last couple verses that we read, there's a commentary here that with that signature, it makes some mention of an X symbol that was the last letter of the Heb alphabet in antiquity. That symbol was used as a mark of exemption from judgment. And it goes on to say, so confident is Job in his own innocence that he asked for a written indictment from the one who would bring the charge against him. So he's almost like daring God to make an indictment against him. Is that kind of?
Yeah, Job has been pretty insistent since chapter 3 that he's done nothing wrong. And after battling with the wits of his three friends for all this time and them having nothing, he's probably pretty confident at this point that, even God can't find anything wrong with me. Clearly, because God hasn't appeared and said anything yet. So clearly I'm in the wrong. Clearly I'm not in the wrong. I dare God to try and show up and tell me I did something wrong. That's exactly what he's going to get. But yeah, no, great point there. Yeah, Job is definitely thinking himself very much innocent of the suffering that he is facing. But there is a distinction. Job does not see himself as perfect. He's not going to go as far and say, I'm perfect. But he is very confident in his thoughts that he did nothing to deserve what is happening. So I just wanted to point that out because that subtle difference would be the difference in someone being completely wrong, and in this case, Job actually being right. He did not do anything to deserve what's happening because this is not a punishment. This is a test. Any other thoughts before we jump forward? All right, then let us flip our Bibles to chapter 38, and we will see what it is that God has to say when God bursts forth onto the scene. In verse 3, this is the first time we get those words, brace yourself like a man, I will question you. In chapter 40, it's a similar statement, but that's where we get that gird up your loins and I will question thee. It's a very cool verse. I just like the way that that's gird up your loins. I will, you will answer me. Oh, okay. Yeah. We are on you, Carol. Sorry, before we get into reading, I just want to point out that the entirety of God's speech, everything God has to say from chapters 38 to 41, if we want to boil the whole thing down into a one-sentence summary, the summary would be God's wisdom is greater than Job could ever understand. Therefore, Job needs to shush. If we took everything in the next 4 chapters into one sentence, that's what it would come to. But I split this up in the way that I did because there is a very structured way that God's argument is formulated. And it goes back to, again, everything we've done so far in Job is very structured, very layered. God's words here are going to do the exact same thing. We'll see this starting to play out once we get into reading, but I just wanted to throw that out there before we start. Carol, could you take that first section of chapter 38 and read verses 4 through 11?
Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurement? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the heavenly beings shouted for joy? Or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribed bounds for it, and set bars and doors, and said, thus far shall you come, and no further. And here shall your proud waves be stopped.
All right, thank you. So all of chapters 38 through 41, main point, God, more wise than Job could ever understand. This first section here, this is an appeal to the fact that God is wiser than Job because God has a lot more lived experience than Job. While Job is however many years old he is at this point, let's just say Job is 60. I don't know. However old Job is, however many years Job has existed, God's been around a little bit longer, at least. More like a lot longer. This first section is God saying to Job, hey, I was around when all of these things happened. You weren't. I've been around much longer than you could ever understand or hope to be around. Because I've been around and existed for so much longer than you, I have more wisdom because I have that much more experience. That's what this boils down to here. And all of these things that God is saying, laying Earth's foundation, marking off the dimensions, shutting the sea behind doors, these are very ancient things. These are aspects of creation. The creation stories in Genesis, God makes heaven and earth, land, sea. That's what God is talking about here. So while this entire discourse over these next 4 chapters is very much God saying how wise God is compared to Job, there is also a very, very rich theme of creation going on here. This chapter 38 and 39 are basically creation accounts from God's perspective. In Genesis chapter 1 and 2, we have 2 creation accounts written from the perspective of the people who wrote them. This is a creation account from God's perspective. And we're going to hear, as we get deeper into it, it is very different than the creation stories we get in Genesis. Any thoughts so far? Anything popping up for anyone on that first section?
Wasn't this a reading part of the, isn't this reading part of the lectionary that is used, I believe, at some point as the first reading?
Yeah. Yeah, Job doesn't pop up very much in the lectionary, but when it does, it's usually these parts where God is talking about how great creation is and how powerful God is for making it. Yes. Yeah. Someone in the morning session today said that this stuff's a lot easier to read than what we've been on the last 4 or 5 weeks. Yeah, it's a lot easier to read this stuff about God talking about creation as opposed to questioning whether or not God is good. So this what we're doing here. This is theology. We've done our framework, we've done our background the last 4 or 5 weeks, wrestling with those questions. This is where it pays off. Of everything we've talked about and read the last few weeks, all of it's now coming out right here. And those questions we have about God, relationship to humans, that's center stage, and that's all we're going to be talking about this week and next week. And Tom, you are up next to read. So could you take that next section for us? Staying in chapter 8, verses 12 to 18, please.
Have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the dawn to know its place, so that it might take hold of the skirts of the earth, and the wicked be shaken out of it? It is changed like clay under the sea, under the seal, and it is dyed like a garment. Light is withheld from the wicked, and their uplifted arm is broken. Have you entered into the springs of the sea, or walked in the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been revealed to you, or have you seen the gates of deep darkness? Have you comprehended the expanse of the earth? Declare if you know all this.
All right, thank you. So that first section we read in chapter 38, God is more wise than Job because God has been around much longer. God has had much more time to gain wisdom. This section, God is more wise than Job because God has all of this power and knows how to use it. God has the power to shape the earth like clay, to take light away from those who are wicked, to go to the bottom of the sea, stand at the gates of death, and know exactly what to do in all those situations, how to form the earth, how to take away light from the wicked. So this is God's appeal to wisdom through power. God has all this power that Job could never hope to understand and knows how to use it, what to do with it. Therefore, God is wiser than Job because Job could never do these things. If we remember, we talked a couple weeks ago about those questions of theodicy, about God being all powerful, God being good. Again, this is where those questions start to come back into play. Because in these verses, God very much seems all powerful. God has these powers to command the day and night, to go to the depths of the sea, to stand at the door to the gates of death. These are very powerful things. So those questions of theodicy that we brought up and used a couple times, wondered, could maybe some of these help us understand what's going on with Job? They're popping up here again, because if you're Job and the thing that you're questioning is whether or not God is actually good, and now you have God appearing to you, telling you, well, here's all the things I do, my power is amazing. Yeah, God is all powerful, yet bad things still happen. Is this maybe an indictment against God as to Job being right? This is where some of those ideas once again start coming full circle, and we can see those again. Yes, I see a hand up.
Yes, are his friends hearing this as well, or is this strictly between God and Job? Do we know that?
That is an excellent question. Because for all of chapter 38 through 41, it says that God is talking to Job. There's a couple times where Job speaks to God for a couple verses. And then all the way in chapter 42 at the very end, it says, after the Lord had said all these things to Job, God said to Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. So I would say in my non-expert answer that God is saying all these things to Job, and the friends are unable to hear it because God is not talking to them. I'm not an expert, but that's my answer. And I am just throwing it out there, and I'm fine with saying that I might be wrong with that. But that is my answer, and based on how this is written, that's how I understand it. But yeah, that is a excellent question.
You know, it's interesting in chapter 1, for the first 15 verses are about author's description of what happened in heaven, a discourse, dialogue between God and Satan. So we have that in our background, which makes it easier to interpret all these chapters. But when it comes to this last few chapters, God never says, I was playing games with you. I was trying to, he never says that. So if we hadn't had that written part of what the author said in the first few verses of chapter 1, would our interpretation be different when it comes here?
Yeah, that's a very good question. In terms of our understand, this is why I made that distinction, the first class of the divine and the human perspective. I feel like without that prologue, our human perspective would still be the same, because we'd still have Job and his friends, they'd still have all their conversations, we would still see this the same way. But yeah, in light of the divine perspective we get in chapter 1, knowing that this is all a game, if you will, between God and Satan, it does kind of throw a wrench into some things, especially here when we get to God's dialogue. Knowing the fact that in the beginning all this started because Satan basically said, hey God, I bet you this, God saying you're on, and then never at any point does God enlighten Job about the real nature of why this was happening, or tell him that he was right in saying that he never did anything wrong. It does kind of make, it does kind of throw a question mark when you get to the last chapter, chapter 42, of when God declares Job vindicated. It kind of throws a big question mark up there into what was the point of all this and how does this ending make sense? I'm going to take just this opportunity to say that the ending of Job and a completely different perspective on interpreting the whole book, that's what we're going to be doing next week. So I'm just going to say sequel bait, because that's the word that they use in cinema if you're setting something up for the next film. So a lot of things that we're going to say or get into tonight are probably going to be sequel bait, because next week we're going to, hopefully, if we get far enough through the guide today, next week we're just going to briefly look over chapter 42, ask a couple questions about does the ending make sense, and then spend the rest of the class looking at a completely different way of interpreting the entire book. All right. But yeah, no, that was a great question. I've already forgot who read last. I think it was Tom, correct? I'm not sure.
Yes.
Okay. That means we are back to Rhonda. Could you take chapter 38, verses 22 through 30?
Have you entered the storehouses of the snow, or have you seen the storehouses of the hail, which I have reserved for the time of trouble, for the day of battle and war? What is the way to the place where the light is distributed, or where the east wind is scattered upon the earth? Who has cut a channel for the torrents of rain and a way for the thunderbolt, to bring rain on a land where no one lives, on the desert which is empty of human life, to satisfy the waste and desolate land, and to make the ground put forth grass? Has the rain a father, or who has begotten the drops of dew? From whose womb did the ice come forth? And who has given birth to the hoarfrost of heaven? The waters become hard like stone, and the face of the deep is frozen.
All right, thank you. I would just like to point out, I think that my version of the Bible is more correct. I see this pencil mark here, and it says, "Have you entered the storehouses of snow or the storehouses of hail, which I reserved for Indiana in January?" I think that's more correct. Anyway.
Oh, very good, very good.
That first section in chapter 38 we looked at. God is wiser than Job because God has a lot more experience existing. Second chapter, God is wiser than Job because God has the power over creation and how to use that power. This third section, it's a little bit more subtle. The reason God is wise here is the knowledge of what is needed by creation, the knowledge of how to care for it. These ideas of having the snow, the hail, the rain stored, putting the snow and the rain and the hail on the earth where they belong, cutting rivers, sending down the rain, sending down the lightning. All of these things are ways in which, in a roundabout way, God cares about creation. God is the caretaker of the earth. And in knowing when, where, and how to dispense of all these different types of weather, God is showing God's vast wisdom by having the knowledge of what all parts of creation need to flourish. So we had wisdom from experience, wisdom from power. Now we have wisdom from knowledge, the knowledge of what creation needs, how to take care of it. Does that making sense to everyone? How we've got these three different ideas so far and the structure that God is using, that is being used here.
Yes.
Yes.
All right. Any thoughts anyone has before we go to the, let's just go to the next section, finish chapter 38 real quick. We'll pause for thoughts. Renee, can you finish off our chapter 38 for us, verses 31 through 38? I guess it's not finishing the chapter, but the last section we have on this chapter.
Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades? Can you loosen Orion's belt? Can you bring forth the constellations in their seasons, or lead out the fair with its cubs? Do you know the laws of the heavens? Can you set up God's dominion over the earth? Can you raise your voice to the clouds? You cover yourself with a flood of water. Do you send the lightning bolts on their way? Do they report to you, "Here we are"? Who gives the ibis wisdom, or gives the rooster understanding? Who has the wisdom to count the clouds? Who can tip over the water jars of the heavens when the dust becomes hard and the clods of earth stick together?
All right, thank you. So we had those other three ideas: experience, power, knowledge. This is God taking all three of those ideas and bringing them all together. God has the power to tell the constellations in the sky, tell the universe where all the stars go, has the knowledge to set up the laws of the heavens, set up God's dominion over all the earth and all creation. And God has the experience because a long time ago when all these things happened, God was the one there doing it. So Job 38, that is your threefold argument of God. God is wiser because of wisdom, because of power, because of knowledge, all things Job could never hope to understand, all why God is more wise than Job could ever be. And if you look at your guide, all of these things have to do with inanimate parts of creation. God hasn't even gotten to anything in creation that is living. This is all just weather and stars and the way everything was set up. So these are all the ways God is wise, and we haven't even gotten to anything in creation that's living yet. This is just the backbone of creation that we're on. Anyone have any final thoughts or questions about any of the stuff we read in chapter 38 before we move on? All right then. Okay. So chapter 39, I guess it's chapter 38, verse 39. The last three verses of chapter 38 really flow naturally into chapter 39. So why chapter 39 doesn't start 3 verses earlier, I will never know. I'm not the one who numbered the chapters and verses in the Bible. That just makes more sense. So chapter 39, God is now going to move away from the inanimate parts of creation, move away from the weather, the cosmos, the shape of the earth, and get into the details of how and in what ways the living creatures on earth show the splendor, show the power, show the wisdom of God. So Jennifer, could you take chapter 38, verse 39 through chapter 39, verse 4? Then when she is done, Kim, could you take chapter 39, verses 5 through 8? And then when Kim is done, Nick, could you take chapter 39, verses 9 through 12? We're going to listen to all three of these one after another, and then we're going to discuss them. Because there are some similarities going on here, and I want to ask, what are the similarities between these three passages that people pick up on? So everyone got their assignments?
Yes.
All right, fantastic. All right, Jennifer, kick us off.
Can you hunt the prey for the lion or satisfy the appetite of the young lions when they crouch in their dens or lie in wait in their covert? Who provides for the raven its prey when its young ones cry to God and wander about for the lack of food? Do you know when the mountain goats give birth? Do you observe the calving of the deer? Can you number the months that they fulfill? And do you know the time when they give birth, when they crouch to give birth to their offspring and are delivered of their young? Their young ones become strong. They grow up in the open. They go forth and do not return to them.
Who has let the wild ass go free? Who has loosed the bonds of the swift ass, to which I have given the steppe for its home, the salt land for its dwelling place? It scorns the tumult of the city. It does not hear the shouts of the driver. It ranges the mountains as its pasture, and it searches after every green thing.
Is the wild ox willing to serve you? Will it spend a night at your crib? Can you tie it in the furrow with ropes? Or will it harrow the valleys after you? Will you depend on it because its strength is great? Or will you hand over your labor to it? Do you have faith in it that it will return and bring your grain to your threshing floor?
All right, thank you, readers. All right, so question for everyone. And I have 4 answers to this question written down here. That does not mean there are only 4 answers, and that does not mean that if you don't come up with 4 answers, it's a bad thing. But question to everyone. Any similarities, anything that all 3 of these passages have in common, any common themes between them?
all related to animals and their cycles.
All of them are related to animals and the cycles. Yeah. Can you say more or?
Well, some of these we could answer. Chapter 39. Do you know when the mountain goats give birth? We know that now. We know from the park ranger will tell you that. So can you number the months in which they fulfill? Yeah. We know some of that now, but we didn't determine it.
Yeah. Yeah. Great answer. That's the answer. I'm going to say again, that's the sequel bait answer. Because, yeah, we read this and God is like, Job, do you know all these things? And Job is like, well, no, I don't know all of these things, God. We read this in the modern day and we go, yeah, we do know all of these things. We do observe these things happening. We know about these things. That's something that we're going to come back to next week, that difference in Job's wisdom and our wisdom, and kind of question maybe why that difference is there, and maybe even poke the bear and ask the question of, is it a good thing that we know these things? So stay tuned for next week. But yes, that is a great answer. Anyone else? Any similarities between these passages? All right, all these passages are about animals. What is God's relationship to all these animals? What does God say about all of them? What does God do for all of them?
He created them.
God created them and
Determine the cycle.
determined the cycle. Very
He
close.
Cares for them.
Cares for them. Yes, very good. Yeah. These are all things that God has created, God has cared for. Again, building on that knowledge of God had the power to make creation, God has the knowledge of how to care for it. To take that even a step further, most of these animals are things that, again, if we look at this in Job's time, these are things that are free from human influence. Lions, ravens, mountain goats, wild donkeys, wild oxen. These are animals that not only are they created by God, not only are they sustained by God, they exist totally free of human influence. And they are well off for it. God even says that the donkey laughs at the commotion of humans. These are animals that thrive apart from human interaction, which, again, in our modern day, not entirely true, because people have ravens as pets. You can drive up to a lion on an African safari. We have mountain goats in zoos. We domesticated donkeys and oxen hundreds of years ago. So again, leading up till next week, we're going to talk more in depth about all of that. Anyone have any other similarities they observed? I've got one more written down, but it's a bit obscure and it's a bit of a stretch. I'm not expecting anyone to come up with it, but anyone else have anything first? All right, the last thing I've got written down here, kind of going along with that idea that these animals are separate from humans, they thrive without humans, is the question of, do these animals despise humans? Once again, we have the lion, where humans would say lions are dangerous. We have the wild ox, the wild donkey, where people in Job's time would say they are dangerous, you cannot tame them. Are these animals that despise humans? Are these animals who maybe in our modern day despise humans because that view of them that was in Job's time, that they are dangerous, that they are not to be trifled with, that they are meant to have their own space, is no longer the case in our world? That one's more of a thought. and more sequel bait for next week. 'Cause,
Well, their brains aren't like ours, so I don't know if they think like that exactly. But
and it's just a thought experiment. But yeah, next week we are going to come back to chapters 38 and 39 with a different perspective. And that different perspective changes the way we view the entire book of Job if we choose to say that this is what we think is really happening. So that's why I keep saying all this stuff sets up for next week, because we're gonna come back to this next week with a fresh pair of glasses, and it's gonna be interesting. All right. So, but there's a question. So God talked about all these animals: lions, ravens, mountain goats, wild ox, wild donkeys, all of these animals that exist free from human influence, that exist in their own habitats, and how great it is that they exist in those habitats, how great it is they're away from humans. And then we get to verse 19. And God goes on a bit of a discourse on horses and how great they are. But horses were domesticated by humans at this point. So what's going on here? What's the deal with this? How do these passages go together? Carol, I believe, is our next reader. Staying in chapter 38 verses, staying in chapter 39. My bad, sorry. Staying in chapter 39 verses 19 through 25, if you would please.
Do you give the horse its might? Do you clothe its neck with mane? Do you make it leap like the locust? Its majestic snorting is terrible. It paws violently, exalts mightily. It goes out to meet the weapons. It laughs at fear and is not dismayed. It does not turn back from the sword. Upon it rattle the quiver, the flashing spear and the javelin. With fierceness and rage, it swallows the ground. It cannot stand still at the sight of the trumpet. When the trumpet sounds, it says, aha. From a distance, it smells the battle, the thunder of the captains and the shouting.
All right, thank you, Carol. So we have the horse, which, unlike all those previously named animals, has been domesticated by humans and is used by humans. But God still lists it just as great. The question is why? What about the horse makes it great?
Well, if the horse does not have the innate tendency, the man cannot do anything with it.
Okay, that's a good answer.
I have a side note in here that says the war horse seems to be the one exception to the rule in the divine speeches. It does serve humanity. It has a human rider. Nevertheless, this animal too is wild. It rejoices in battle and facilitates the killing of the human beings by other human beings. So is this because, unlike some of the other animals, like ox or whatever, we can dominate a horse or train a horse or be a master of a horse?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Is the horse great because it is something that we can master and dominate? It's an excellent question. So to answer that, I want to bring up, and this is a very, very subtle shift in the way that we view creation, but being able to understand and grasp this very small shift is going to be the center of, spoiler alert, everything we're going to do next week once we finish off Job chapter 42 in the opening minutes. is that there is the question of, is the horse great because humans can master it? There are two perspectives that are going on here. There is the first perspective, which is the view that creation is centered around humans, the view that everything that is in creation that isn't human exists solely for the purpose of humans. This is your Genesis chapter 1, Genesis chapter 2 creation accounts. Everything was made, then humans were made. They were told to fill the earth, subdue it. Very much that idea of everything that's out there that's not a person is there for human benefit. It's a human-centric view of creation. The second view is a very slight shift where the things in creation that humans use, like in this example, the horse that humans tame and use for warfare, it is not great because it was meant to be used by humans, but because humans use it to make themselves greater is what makes the horse great. The horse was not made to be used by humans, which is the human-centric view. But this view, the very subtle shift, is the horse is great because it is great, it is useful to humans. Is that distinction making sense to people? Because this is a very subtle shift in thinking. But that is the complete difference between the creation accounts in Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2 that come from the human perspective, and this creation account in these two chapters that comes from God's perspective. The horse isn't great because it was made for humans. Because the horse is great, humans use it to better and more advance themselves. Is this subtle difference making sense to people? And if not, that's okay, because it's a hard thing to try and wrap our heads around, because it's a very small, subtle shift in the way we view creation. This small distinction between those two different views of creation, once we finish Job chapter 42 in the opening minutes of next week, that shift, that slightly different viewpoint is what we're going to spend the rest of our time on. And we're going to apply that small change of thought to the entire book of Job. I saw someone unmuted, but I didn't know who it was.
Was it God's intent to, from a creation point, for the horse to do that for humans, or did he kind of leave it out as I'm making humans and I'm making horses, and it's up to humans to make it happen?
Yeah. Write that question down, save it for next week. It's not that I don't want to answer the question now, because it is a great and fascinating question. But if I do answer that question now, it's too deep of a rabbit hole for the time we have, and that's what we're going to be spending most of next week on. But yeah, fantastic question. All right, I know that it's already 8:31 and we're 1 minute past, but there's just one more short section of 5 verses I want to get through before we sign off tonight. And it will make planning for next week and the flow of it be a lot smoother. So just bear with me for a couple more minutes. I'm just going to read this section real quick. This is the first 5 verses of chapter 40. The Lord said to Job, "Will the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? Let him who accuses God answer him." Then Job answered the Lord, "I am unworthy. How can I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, but I have no answer. Twice, but I will say no more." Job's like, yeah, I got nothing. I asked for you to show up. I asked for you to talk to me. Now you're here, and I got nothing, which I don't think there's really another response that one could have in light of everything that God has said just now. And this does mirror words that Job used earlier in his dialogue when we were looking through that first dialogue cycle in one of the chapters. I don't remember which one off the top of my head. I think it might have been chapter 10. Job admitted that he knows the wisdom and knowledge of God far exceeds his own, and he could never answer God 1 time in 1,000. But he still feels like he deserves to get an answer from God as to what's happening. And now that he's getting his answer, yeah, you can't answer God, but he kind of saw that coming, and I think we all kind of saw that coming. Anyone have any final thoughts or questions or anything before we sign off for the evening? All right. Let us close our time together in the way that we normally do. Let us pray the words of the Lord's Prayer. Our Father,
Father,
who art in
who art in
heaven,
heaven,
hallowed be thy
hallowed
name.
be thy name.
Thy
Thy
kingdom
kingdom
come,
come,
thy
thy
will be
will
done,
be done
on earth
on
as
earth
it is
as
in
it
heaven.
is in heaven.
Give us this
Give us
day
This
our
day our
daily
daily
bread,
bread,
and forgive us our trespasses,
trespasses,
as
as
we
we
forgive
forgive
those who
those
trespass against us. And lead us
And
not
Lead
into
us not
temptation,
into temptation,
but
but
deliver
deliver
us
us
from
from
evil.
evil.
Thine is the
Thine is
kingdom,
the kingdom,
the
the
power,
power,
and the
the
glory,
glory,
forever and
forever
ever.
and ever.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you for everyone who was on tonight. Thank you everyone for sticking with this Bible study. This has been this is a challenging text to go through. It's been hard at times, so want to commend everyone for sticking with it. Yeah, last week is our next week on Job. I hope it lives up to all the hype that I've been getting it, because I kind of hyped it up a little bit. So I hope
Thank
everyone
you. I
comes
know
back
more
for
about
next-
Job than I ever did before.
that was the goal. So it's good to hear. So
Thank
hope
you.
everyone's able to be on next week, and hopefully next week will be as exciting as I've made it sound like it will be.
We'll be
You have
counting
to
on
come
it.
now.
Well, so take care, everyone.
Okay, stay safe
Same
and warm,
time next-
everybody.
All right,
Thank you
stay
and
warm.
good night.
Right.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye.